Today I'm having a gas with Yoad Nevo, award-winning, era-defining producer here in London, made famous not only by the hit records he's worked on, but also by the educational content he's delineated across YouTube for Waves and other providers. So I'm excited to be here speaking to Yoad, and we thought today that we'd maybe talk a little bit about the new emerging technology. I'm hearing it more and more in music production every day, and that's Dolby Atmos. But first, before we go into the specifics about Dolby Atmos, Yoad, how are you doing? What's going on?
Yeah, I've been very busy with Dolby Atmos mixing, but also product development. I've been doing that for many years. I started my way in surround sound in the early 2000s when we developed the Waves surround bundle. I have a patent on my name for upmixing, so upmixing stereo content to surround to 5.1. So I'm very much aware of the technology, and I've been following the development or the evolution of Dolby from where it started as a format for immersive sound for cinema, and how it's found its way into mainstream music, which is what we're starting to see now.
My impression is that Dolby, as a company and immersive as a format, mostly served the needs of cinema
Mhm.
and moving image. Now it's coming into music on its own. What's happened? What's the history of that?
Well, if you look at the big picture, the music industry needs a change of format every few decades. We saw that with the transition from mono to stereo
Yep,
and then from vinyl to CD.
yep.
There was an attempt, like I mentioned, in the early 2000s or the late 1990s to establish surround sound through 5.1,
Yep.
but it failed. So now the market is ready for a new format. Obviously, the transition to streaming, and the next stage is surround sound. This gives the labels an opportunity to resell their catalog.
Okay.
So basically, financially, that's what it's all about. Along the way, the listeners can benefit from that. The reason why the 5.1 format didn't catch on was because of the setup. In order to enjoy it, you had to install 6 speakers in your living room and things like that, and people were not having it.
There was a prohibitive cost to immersive audio. You have to be able to afford and have the space for many speakers to be able to start accessing the format, which means
Absolutely.
it was only available to audiophiles, specialists, and hobbyists,
And cinemas,
and
which,
cinema.
permanent setups where you just do an installation once and you have it there. And that's where Dolby format and Dolby Atmos later started.
Okay.
Um, since then, we've been developing technologies for delivering immersive sound through headphones. We developed the Waves NX, which is a technology which allows binaural processing of surround sound into headphones.
Yeah.
And this is the kind of most common format. Apple has their own format, which is mainly used. Dolby have their own format. I wouldn't say that it recreates the experience 100%, but it gets you pretty close.
Yoad just laid out for us as a narrative of how the music industry was driven by technological change. At first, sound in general would come from a single speaker. Everything was in mono. Intuitively, that would be the case because the way you experience sound in the world is you have two ears, and generally every sound source is a single thing, emanating towards you. Everything is generally in mono. And in the 1960s, if I'm not mistaken, there was a push to move towards stereo where there would be two different sound sources and two different speakers. And of course, there's controversy over early Beatles records that were kind of forced into stereo where you have drums all on the right and bass all on the left. So it's quite a disorienting experience. But if I'm reading it correctly, those decisions were made to push stereo technology.
in the same way as big technology companies like Apple, Amazon, of course, Dolby are pushing that format.
So what we're
forward.
seeing now is not new. This is the way the industry has worked for a long time.
Absolutely.
There is a Dolby Atmos mixing setup in here, which, if I'm not mistaken, requires 10 speakers. Is that right?
Actually, it's 12 speakers. The setup I have here is 714.
714.
So seven satellite speakers, a sub, and 4 top speakers.
On the ceiling.
Yeah.
So you have height.
You have height, which you didn't have in the 5.1 and 7.1 formats.
It was all wide, but it didn't go up and down.
So you had the XY, and now we added the Z.
And you're able to do that because you have speaker cones all around us. There's sound coming from up there. There's sound coming from here. I don't understand how that gets mixed down into stereo. Ultimately, my Apple AirPods are still, if I'm not mistaken, 2 speaker cones, putting 2 sound sources, 1 into each ear. How do you get this spatial thing down to that?
Okay, so if you think of it, you have 2 holes here. You don't have 8.
That's right.
You have 2 holes, which means that all the information you get, all the spatial information and cues that you get from your surrounding has to be implemented through 2 holes here, and then your brain interprets this information and lets you kind of find your way and identify sound sources from different places on the X, Y, and Z planes.
Okay.
So the way it works is you have your skull, you have the distance between your 2 ears, you have the pinna, which is the shape of your ear lobe, basically. And those factors basically make your brain analyze sounds and pinpoint the direction to a certain source in any dimension.
Okay.
If I have a sound source coming from this direction, so it will arrive at my left ear sooner than it will arrive at my right ear. This distance already tells my brain that I need to look that way.
Right. So this is all happening at like lightning speed in the brain, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Not lightning speed, it's 1 millisecond per axon firing. And so it takes a few milliseconds, but this is how we work. This is how all mammals hear.
Yeah.
We have stereo, we have stereo visions like predators. We also have stereo hearing, which is also immersive, but the source condensed into stereo.
Okay, so in essence, the world is already, it bears saying the world is already immersive, and you've already only got 2 eardrums. Hence, Dolby Atmos, it should be workable on that principle alone. It's like you're already mixing everything down to stereo.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So what we have to do, and this is what we did with Waves NX, which is a technology that brings immersive sound into stereo, into headphones. Dolby have their own format. Apple have their own format, and there are a few others. Sony have their own format. There are a few others. The way we do it is we simulate the structure of the skull. We apply delays and we apply reflections. This is very important because if you were in an anechoic chamber, you would have a very hard time finding out the source of sounds.
Okay, so if you're in a chamber which produces no reflections and echo, it would actually be quite unsettling because
you would know that it comes from that direction because it arrives to your ear first.
But that's all.
So you would look there, but you wouldn't know whether it's from here, from up or down.
Wow.
And for that, you need the early reflections. So this is something that we introduce to the signal in order to focus the direction and make it more understandable for our brain.
Yeah.
So we basically model the shapes of rooms. There are 2 technologies. We have the original Waves NX, and then we have convolution-based. And then we have convolution-based NX, which we measure certain rooms like Abbey Road Studio 3 with their surround setup, and we, record the speakers, each speaker, and then we emulate all the reflections and all the timing differences, but also you have a filter that is applied to the signal by the shape of your ear.
So because your ear is kind of pointing forwards like a radar, what's behind it gets a little bit filtered off by the earlobe itself.
That, and also the shape, the inner shape of this cone.
Mhm.
Everyone knows that if you do something like that, you get a lot of mid-range,
Yeah,
because you interfere with the frequency response of your earlobe.
right.
So we also take that into account. So all these things together allow us to emulate the way our brains interpret surround or immersive sound.
Okay, so there's been a lot of long and well-informed and complex development going on to emulate the way the ear behaves in a 360 environment. Okay, so that's like one answer as to how the Dolby thing gets mixed down to stereo. And there are different ways of mixing it down to stereo. What's the stated benefit? Why is this an improvement? Why is it making music better? Because I have the impression that we went from mono and we went to stereo, which was controversial at the time. There were some big producers like Phil Spector and Brian Wilson who weren't happy about stereo because, I think it was Brian Wilson who said it gave him the feeling that the consumer was doing their own final mix, that they were moving the elements themselves, and Brian Wilson wanted absolute control. But eventually, stereo became less about hard placing entire elements and more about recreating the binaural stereophonic experience. So generally, most stuff is in the center and there's detail on the sides, and it gives you the impression of a little bit of space. It gives you the impression of a three-dimensional area when mixed well. And that was enough for us for a long time. Like, we had this curve accelerate to stereo, and then things stay in stereo for 50 years. Why is it a good thing that we're now trying to move forward into Dolby now?
There are certain benefits to hearing immersive sound translated to binaural.
Yeah.
It doesn't sound the same as hearing it from 12 speakers that surround you, but we can recreate some of the experience. In the same way that when you listen to a live show on in stereo, you kind of find yourself in an immersive situation, although there's no information from the back, from the rear, which is not the case if you were in a concert hall. So we get some of the experience, and that's enough to give us the added value. And together with the financial incentives of the record labels, this is enough to try to push this format,
Yep.
which gives you, I would say, another. So it's not 100% like being here in a setup like that, but if it's 40% or 50%, it's enough to get these companies to push this format forward.
Yeah.
Because it means a surge in sales, or in streaming for that matter. All the back catalog is being remixed now in Dolby Atmos. All the new artists get their music mixed in Dolby Atmos, and this has a benefit at the moment. For instance, the Apple algorithm on Apple Music prioritizes Dolby Atmos mixes by 10%. So if you get your music mixed in Dolby Atmos, automatically you get 10%. The algorithm pushes you up by a certain amount. Amazon Prime and Netflix only accept music for the TV series or films in Dolby Atmos. So they don't accept stereo.
They don't accept the 2.0 mix anymore.
No.
Wow.
So this is happening.
Yeah.
It's happening.
And Apple, Netflix, Amazon, the big players of our time, are putting their foot on the accelerator to push Dolby into the mainstream.
There's been a setback and there's been a bit of a pushback. I think that people still associate Dolby Atmos with having to have like loads of speaker around the house,
Yeah.
loads of speakers around the house and all that mess. But now we have sound beams, we have sound bars that can again recreate some of the experience. But if it's 30%, then it's more immersive than stereo. Stereo was more immersive than mono. And what you said is very true. In the early days of stereo, people used to mix it in a very extreme way and to almost abuse the format because it was the Wild West. Anything was possible. So they put the drums here and the vocals here. And it's cool for the time. These days, the way we mix in stereo is that we have most of the important information, certainly the beat and the vocal, dead center. So you get a phantom image from the two speakers, which is dead center. And then you have the immersive elements, which gives the depth of field and the width.
Yeah. Okay, so you get left, right, front, back with stereo.
And the same applies to Dolby Atmos. The way we mix in Dolby Atmos is not that we're gonna put the one drum here and one drum there and the piano here. We still rely on the front of like a stage image where the important information is coming from the left and right speakers. We also use the center speaker for vocal because that gives us added headroom mechanically on the speakers. So instead of two speakers having to move air that includes bass drum, snare, bass, which takes a lot of energy, and other important elements, and to have the vocal on top, you now have a center speaker, which is what we inherited from the cinema format.
Okay, so cinema gave us left speaker, right speaker, and center speaker.
And all the dialogue is in the center speaker.
So it's not phantom mono anymore, it's true mono.
It's true mono, and you have a whole speaker dedicated to the vocals.
Which gives it headroom because suddenly the vocals are not competing with other voltage coming out of other speakers.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So we can utilize that, and we can also use the other speakers. So we have the side speakers, which are very important because the back speakers are a little bit more problematic because we're not used to be hearing important information from the back. And if we do, then we turn around. And this is the big no-no for surround mixing.
You're putting any important information behind you.
You don't want people to do this.
Yeah.
You want people to have an immersive experience. You want everything to engulf them with sound in a natural way. So that applies to proper surround or immersive mixing. And the interesting thing is that we are going to see productions made in immersive sound. And this is something that I've been working on for a few years now. And a lot of my productions these days start in Dolby Atmos.
Yes.
I think I showed you my 6 speaker guitar. So each string coming out of a different speaker. And when you play the guitar, it's a very immersive experience, which we talked about headroom. So rather than recording a guitar and then doubling it to have a left-right kind of wide image, I can play one guitar and each string is coming from a different speaker, and I get this big immersive sound with just one instrument.
Yes.
So there are many elements that kind of you can treat them in a different way when you produce in surround from the beginning. And this is different from taking back catalog or productions that were made in stereo and upmixing them.
Yes, I was very excited by your guitar with a pickup for every speaker in Dolby. That was the first thing I'd heard, music only, that made me think, this is where we're going. Not that I'm an expert to be taken seriously, but it was the first thing I'd heard where I'm like, oh, this feels like a new thing, not an adaptation of an old thing. So on that exact point, you mentioned upmixing, and of course, most people watching will know that downmixing is when you take something from a multi-track and you mix it down to 2 tracks. Upmixing, by your description, is the opposite of that. You start with a stereo and you extract from the stereo the different elements and place them in a more immersive field.
That's traditional upmixing. This is what our product Upmix, which we developed back in the early 2000s, that's what that does. So you take a finished mix, a stereo mix, and you upmix it into 5.1. But if you have the multitrack or the stems, then you can mix the entire song in Dolby Atmos. So you have the different elements and you can decide, oh, I want the vocal, like we said, in the center.
Mhm.
I want the strings to be on the sides, but I want them to reverberate
Yeah.
on the back, and I want the tambourine to come from the top. So suddenly you get a 3D stage,
Yeah.
which is probably unrealistic, and we have to be very careful. I wouldn't say careful, but thoughtful about how we mix stuff in Dolby Atmos,
Yes.
because we don't want to have the same experience as the Beatles. Records are amazing, and some of it is because of that fact. Like if you listen to Revolver, it's amazing, and you wouldn't want it to be different. You wouldn't want it to be mixed in like proper stereo of how we mix today. That's the charm of it.
Mm.
And there will be some productions, some songs that will be mixed in a funny way if you look at it in perspective of 10 years from now. But I come from the school of traditional spatial audio, and this is my foundation, and I think it's very important to have that. So you start from that. I'll give you an example. If you have a 5.1, 7.1 setup in your living room,
Yeah.
you would have the rear speakers, you would have them by the sofa, right? And you will have the front speakers by the TV. There could be 3-4 meters distance between those two speakers,
Yeah.
which will translate to 3-4 milliseconds of delay, could be more, depending on. So now imagine if you put some rhythmic elements, some percussive elements with transients in the back. So suddenly your shaker or whatever you send there will play before
The downbeat of
the downbeat of the kick.
Yeah.
So you have to take all these kind of parameters into account, and this is the foundation of mixing in surround, and it's very important. Also, you have to remember that we have kind of a dead spot between this angle and this angle. This is our brain.
Mhm.
So we
So
have
here-
less. So here we have really good resolution.
Yeah.
In this kind of 180-degree plane.
Yeah.
But from here, it's more like from 120 to 150 degrees or something like that, that we have less resolution. I wouldn't say it's a dead spot. You would turn, you would know it's coming from here and not from here.
Yeah.
But it would be very hard for people to say, oh, it's here. No, it's here. So we have to understand the theory. We don't have to. We can do whatever. We can be creative and do whatever. But if we want to recreate the immersive experience we experience by nature, by just walking down the street and hearing, I don't know, a plane from there, a bus from there, someone talking to us from there. If we want to recreate that, so it's easier for our brain to interpret that sound, and that's what we want, because we want it to be easy. We want to enjoy the music, rather than if you stop and think, hey, what happened here?
Yeah.
Then you spoil the experience in a way.
So, like, a lot of good mixing is actually about removing obstacles from the listener's attention so that they're experiencing whatever it is that the artist or that the person who made the content is trying to deliver to you, the information or the song or whatever. Mixing is all about getting technical considerations out of the way so that the idea can be fully enjoyed. You talked about abstraction when we talk about the way that the Beatles mixed those stereo records. They're not an attempt to reproduce a real sound experience from the world. It's more like an abstract impressionistic painting. And so, with that, you know, you said that post, let's say, talking about the Beatles, post Rubber Soul, all stereo decisions are artistic decisions. Listening to, let's say, Getting Better from Sergeant Pepper, and you've got this, I think it's on the right, so you've got this really intense kind of and then this huge voices in the middle, and yes, they discovered this new canvas you could work with. Everything before Rubber Soul sounds like it was upmixed quickly to, as you say, sell the format. Are we seeing that, or do you think we're going to see that in Dolby, where there's going to be a sort of a breakthrough moment where we start using the format more creatively, or are we already doing that?
It's not a completely new format like stereo has been when it came out. So we have experience in mixing for film. We have experience in mixing, especially live shows. I used to do so many live DVDs.
You do like
in
the
the
Eagles or something like that on, yeah.
Because it was a format that still had some merit.
Mhm.
So we know how to do that. If you're professional and if you know what you're doing, and the same applies to stereo mixing or any kind of mixing, if you know what you're doing, then you would know how to adapt to this format and do it properly.
Mhm. There we're likely to see that bifurcation we saw with other formats where you have the professionals, as you say, doing it properly, and it will take people who don't know the rules probably to break them in an interesting way, as is the case with everything. But taking another angle, you also mentioned that the manufacturers, Apple and Sony and Dolby themselves, are doing what they can to push the format. So Apple are incentivizing the market to make Atmos mixes by uh, pushing things up the algorithm that have Atmos mixes, which I'm sure is going to frustrate our sort of bedroom producers and people, aspiring artists, no end, because they are now finding out that in order to have their music pushed up the search results, they have to have the budget to afford an Atmos mix, which tends to be reserved for the majors at the moment. I know another mixer in London who is only doing Dolby all the time, and I wasn't aware that there's a controversial trend going on of people separating the stems from stereo mixes using AI tools they find online and then putting those into Dolby mixes. What do you think about the industry behavior towards it? Do you think we're at risk of kind of making it more difficult for new artists to get a foot on the ladder? And what do you think about this behavior of upmixing inappropriately?
I wouldn't say inappropriately because anything goes in art.
Okay.
So when we say that only professional can mix or know how to mix in Dolby Atmos, that's nonsense, because that's how we got the most amazing breakthroughs in music and in any form of art in history, and this will be no exception. So we'll have some. The only consequence is if something is not done properly enough, then the transition to binaural, which mimics how we hear stuff in real life, can be problematic. So if you were to put your lead vocal only in that speaker, then when translate, it could be an amazing experience in the room. Because of the way it's translated to binaural, it could be problematic. In the same way as these days, if you were to mix in stereo and you put your vocal in one side only, then there will be a barrier of kind of getting it into mainstream playlists.
Because if it goes somewhere where it gets down converted to mono,
Suddenly you will have half the energy.
Yeah.
And things like that. So the costs of mixing in Dolby are getting down and down. People now mix using products like Waves NX to mix in binaural, to mix Dolby content in binaural, which is not ideal. However, if you do it properly and you're being very careful, and hopefully people who don't have access to proper surround mix environment, they can go and check their mixes. And there are ways of dealing with that, but it's also a valid approach. Again, if you try to do something extreme, then you will find it very difficult when it gets translated to the real format, like 714, 716, and all that. So there are ways around it. And with regards to using separated stems in order to create a Dolby Atmos mix, the problem with that is the quality of the sound when you separate stems. So if you put them back together in order to, let's say, increase the vocal level, or take the bass down, or making the drums more punchy, that works really well because you have the masking of the other stems. But if you try to separate and then you expose each stem through like panning it or placing it on a separate speaker or something like that, then with today's technology, you're going to get a lot of artifacts.
So let's say we're looking at a 2.0 mix, and maybe a really straightforward example is, you were doing the mix and you wanted a vocal that felt present, that felt very, very close to the listener. And so you have much more low end, maybe we're thinking down to 200 hertz and something like that. And so those frequencies will have been attenuated from the bass so that, hypothetically, so that the voice feels more present and there's not competing frequencies in that area. It's a schoolboy example, but you know what I mean. There's been space made for the vocal and the bass. You strip the stems using AI, and the bass still has that frequency area missing. And so that will be exposed by the mix. Is that kind of what you're describing, or have I not got it right?
Not quite, because the way we separate stems using AI is not really just by frequency.
Okay.
It's more like finding the harmonics that relate to each of the elements. So we can identify the fundamental of each element, and then we associate the given harmonics of that element. So if it's a vocal and we know that the fundamental is whatever, C2 or something like that, then we know that it would have G and then the C and then the other G and then the B flat and all that. Sorry, I forgot the E in the way. But so that's how it works. And we basically then, in a way, resynthesize those with FFT bins. So we're not really taking those. It's not a zero-sum game. So if we separate the vocal, it doesn't mean that we take those frequencies out of the bass. It means that we resynthesize the vocal on its own, and then we resynthesize the bass and the drums and all that. This comes at a cost because the FFT windows don't allow us to be very accurate. So we have to kind of, in the time domain, I mean, it's a bit technical, but we get artifacts in the sort of twilight zone of the detection.
Okay, so to make sure I'm understanding, because now we're talking in a fair amount of detail about actually how you strip stems from music using artificial intelligence, so-called. And if I've understood you correctly, what happens is, even if there are, let's say, attenuations in certain frequency areas of a bass to allow the voice in, when you use AI to strip those stems, it will put those frequencies back in. It will kind of, as you said, resynthesize. It will give you, it will effectively be like a kind of, like the Notre Dame, has been somewhat destroyed and somewhat rebuilt. It's not the original Notre Dame, but it looks the same. That kind of thing?
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
Okay. And so with that being the case, the AI at the moment is still in its, not infancy, but it's still early on enough that it can't give you a like for like exact replica. There's going to be some artifacting or like digital distortion.
Yes, you get that kind of glossy thing which we associate with low quality MP3
Yeah.
and things like that, which is basically from the same family.
Mhm.
When you try to reduce data, like with the data compression, like formats like MP3 and others, then that's kind of what you get. However, if you then, so if you split a song, a stereo mix to its stems, however many they are, and then you put them back together, you will get the identical file.
Oh,
However, if you listen to each one of them, you'll have the artifacts.
Mhm.
But the artifacts disappear when you re-sum all the different elements.
okay. But so if you strip the stereo mix into stems and you resum them in stereo, you'll get the original file. If you resum them in Dolby, you will hear those artifacts. That can
Because you highlight each one individually
Mhm.
alongside its artifacts. And in order to get a proper mix, you would have to add some reverbs, delays,
Yeah.
kind of other stereo enhancers and surround enhancers. And then when you sum it back, it will be nothing like the original.
So I didn't understand a long time ago just the whole concept of energy and headroom, the amount of energy you can put out of a mix. When we have mono, I don't know I'm not an electrical engineer, but when you have mono, you have one speaker, so you can put out as much as that speaker can put out. Suddenly, a stereo, you have twice the amount of energy, you can put out twice as much. Effectively, I don't know the math, so I don't know if it would double, but it would increase the headroom. It would mean you can have more going on in it. And I think where mixers are gonna producers are gonna get really excited about Atmos is when it properly sinks in that you have this expanded headroom, which I wasn't aware of until I was sitting in a Dolby mix a few weeks ago, and we flicked between the 2.0 and the Dolby, and suddenly I understood the attraction of the format because I'm kind of old school. I like 2.0 because we're so used to it and I know what I'm doing in it. But with Dolby, it's like the ceiling just got slightly higher. So, is there any kind of music you think has been hampered by 2.0 that you think is going to benefit from this new expansion in headroom? The answer could be all music, but certainly I have a feeling that classical is going to benefit from this. Dynamic range music.
Yes, but you can argue that metal could benefit from that.
Yeah.
Because you try to, in metal, the drums are so clicky and so punchy. Why can't the bass drum be fat like in hip hop?
Okay, so
While having all these guitars and all that. In theory, it's because of the lack of headroom. You have to cram everything into these two speakers.
Yeah.
So you have to make sure that the bass drum. Okay, so what's the important element of the kick? And this leads to style.
yes,
Because suddenly you have actually the bass drum is so clicky. Let's do a double kick with like 32s
Yeah.
and all that. So this technology and art have always been intertwined.
yes.
So technology leads to new forms of art, and this is what we're starting to see here in the Dolby Atmos sphere.
It gives some true cause for optimism because everyone does, not everyone, but certainly the chattering classes, the intelligentsia, the educated, the frustrated, feel like everything's a bit tired at the moment. Feel like we are in a Groundhog Day. We've said it over and over again, we're getting more Marvel movies, we're getting more Star Wars. If we're getting, what did I watch last night on Netflix? It was like, they've done this 6-part documentary about British music genres, garage, grime, and stuff. But everyone feels like that was the product of a certain time and a certain technology. And you mentioned the fact that metal and the stylistic choices of most of the genres that we know in recorded music came about because of the limitations of 2.0. Metal drums are extremely clicky, i.e., they have like a very quick transient, and then if I'm not mistaken, they really cut into it to make it very quiet. When you have lots of elements and you want it to sound big, ironically, everything has to be quite small. Now we have more headroom, so we might even see new genres accidentally emerge because of the change in the technology.
Absolutely. I experiment a lot with ambient music, which you get the ultimate immersive experience
Yeah.
with. You can just have pads and all that. And since I'm essentially a pop producer, I'm implementing that knowledge and that experience into my pop production, even unconsciously. And I'm also a guitarist, and getting this amazing experience of having each string of a 6-string guitar coming out of a different speaker, it leads me to create new riffs.
Yeah.
And it's a new way of playing,
Yeah.
a new way of creating and producing. So I'm very much for the pushing of this technology from an artistic perspective. I don't care about the labels, the major labels making more money. They have enough.
Yeah.
But as an artist, as a creator, as a mixer, as someone who, creates new technology, I'm fascinated by this and would like to see where it leads us in the next decade, because it will catch on. It's just a matter of time. There's a pushback at the moment, but it will catch on. And we are working on new and better technologies for emulating immersive sound on binaural headphones. And it will just get better and better, and you'll have more positive experience. At the moment, you have, like I said, 30 or 40% of the experience when you listen to surround stuff on headphones. And there's an element of wishful thinking. You kind of have to want to hear the immersive, or to get the immersive experience. So if you have something kind of coming from the back and above and all that, if you say, oh no, it's just some stereo stuff getting filtered and delayed, so you can treat it like that. But if you want to hear it, you can.
Yep.
It's a little bit abstract, and that's not what you want from a kind of high street commercial format. So we need to improve the technology more and more. But since there's money in this industry now,
Mm-hmm.
then it's just a matter of time.
What is it that changed? Why did Dolby start getting pushed in about 2015, 16?
So Dolby is the dominant brand in cinema, sound for films and all that. And they found that there's another market. The music market is pretty big.
Yeah.
The gaming market is pretty big.
Yeah.
So if you tap into that, you have more revenue streams.
I understand with gaming as well, because I have some friends who are fairly hardcore gamers, and the placement of sound, being able to recognize a sound as in front or behind, is essential in something like Call of Duty or Battlefield, where where that matters. I understand it in gaming for sure, and so yeah, music has surprised me. But as far as you're saying just there, it is as simple as there's a whole very large market that we could recapture, and they're working with Apple. It looks like, Apple. Before Spotify, you would say Apple are the largest company that have had influence on the music industry in the 21st century. Spotify are now obviously a big player as well. But yeah, it seems like Apple and Dolby are working together to push this thing. Let's briefly touch on what I accidentally just tripped over, the fact that Spotify don't offer Dolby Atmos at the moment. What do you think about that? Is that going to be inevitable? Do you think inevitably Spotify are going to have to?
I think that they will want to.
Okay.
And I think that at the moment, this is quite a major barrier, because some of the labels are kind of waiting on the sidelines to see what is going to happen with Spotify.
Because they're the biggest brand in commercial music.
Yes, and they can't allocate budgets in order to remix the back catalog in Dolby Atmos, because at the moment there's no viable kind of financial incentive to do that. It's just a matter of time. I'm quite certain that Spotify are working on it, since it's such a huge operation. You can imagine the servers that they have to acquire, and the streaming formats,
Yep.
and all that, everything that's involved with that. So it's just a matter of time.
There is something revealing about that, isn't there? Just about how quickly things are changing in our current climate. 20 years ago in 2005, it was a truism that Apple were the biggest company in consumable music. The one whose opinion mattered most. If iTunes were going to do something in 2005, that's where the industry was going. And so, it's only been 20 years, and now Apple having a format on their streaming service isn't enough of an incentive. It has to be Spotify driving. It has to be Spotify adopting the technology now to drive the innovation.
Spotify is a very significant player in this field, if not the most powerful one. Apple is, very that they have their segment. It's not necessarily music, like that's what Steve Jobs tried to do to crack music and TV.
Mm-hmm.
With TV, it wasn't very successful. With music, it was more successful, but they paved the way for Spotify to come and reap the, you know, the, the fruits of all that effort.
Effectively, Spotify recognized that what people really needed, if not explicitly wanted, was something that looked like iTunes, but was all the music was as accessible as piracy, which is what we have now.
Yeah.
If people want to get stuck in and work in Dolby Atmos, people who don't, because we're here in, Yoad's studio here at Nevo Sound, and this is the result of many years of work, isn't it? And a lot of success and a lot of investment. And, we have this great Neve desk here. We've got this Dolby rig. We've got more great synths and great, outboard gear than you could shake a stick at. But if someone has only got a laptop, how do they get started working in Dolby Atmos?
I would say get something like Waves NX. This is a good starting point. And try to experiment with this format. And I would say go to Dolby Atmos equipped studio setup and check your mixes.
Okay.
Go back and forth. This is really important. This is something that I do all the time, and every Dolby Atmos mixer does all the time, is to check how it translates to binaural. 99.9% of humanity consume music on headphones. So this is the way to, to produce music. This is the format to produce music for. It's more tricky to mix in headphones and to get it translated back properly into a 714 or 7 or, immersive speaker setup.
Checking mixes, you can work in something like Waves NX. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I'm not a Logic user, but I believe Logic comes with its own Dolby Atmos. There's something you can work in Logic.
Yes, you can, as well as Cubase and Pro Tools. You can do that. The Dolby Atmos binaural emulation of immersive sound is not the best. I'm maybe a little bit biased because I produce a similar technology. However, it's all good if you don't want to be left behind as a musician, as a producer, as a mixer. You have to start looking at this format because it's not going to go away.
In the same way that now, when we're working on records, when we're working on productions, and when we're working on mixes, we've always got the mono button just to check that it down mixes to mono in a way that doesn't lose the intention of the music. We're generally not mixing in mono, but we need to know that it works in mono. And it sounds like the new status quo, in sooner than we think, is going to be checking that it works in stereo, going down from Dolby. And then maybe, who knows, going from Dolby to stereo and mono, making sure it works
Absolutely.
at all levels.
Mono is still a viable format. People listen to, most phones are stereo, even the internal speakers, but some are not, and you can't be too sure. So everything has to be compatible from mono to stereo to binaural, and then up to 714, 726, or whatever it is, 926. whatever it is.
Okay. Well, that feels like we started at mono and we end at mono, going through Dolby Atmos. So that seems like a good kind of place to cut off. Is there any final thoughts you've got for us just about where we're going and what you're excited about? Anything you've listened to in Dolby that you feel like is the best use of that format?
Many of the new established artists release really good Atmos mixes. So I would say that this is a good place to start
Yeah.
on Apple Music. If you don't have the surround setup of speakers, you can get some sound bars which will give you some of the experience for cheap. You can get very small satellite speakers, take 2 hours of maybe hanging stuff on the wall and get a foot in the door.
Okay.
I think that this will really catch on once we have wireless powered speakers.
Yeah.
So the wiring and all that is a bit annoying, and that's a big barrier. But we're gonna see more wireless powered speakers, and the audio feeding wirelessly, which we have the technology to do. We can use multi-channel Bluetooth even today. So it's just a matter of finding sockets in the walls, mount even 5.1, just try to immerse yourself in immersive sound.
I like that as a sign-off point. So, Yoad Nevo, thank you for your time.